Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you to our host, CTV, for having us over tonight. Thank you to everyone in the audience. I think so far we have about 28 people as participants. This shows that the subject we're trying to talk about, the conversation we're trying to talk about is of importance and that there's some appetite for it. And I wanted to thank everyone on this panel, every brother and sister on this panel. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for your bravery in being willing to talk about things that we as Black people never actually get to talk about, which is some of the misconceptions we hold against each other. I think it takes bravery to say we are going to not just try to to do our dirty laundry in private, but talk about our misconceptions in the public domain in order to help each other understand where we're coming from, to form a better union, a better unity, so that we can support each other when it's needed the most. Tonight's discussion is going to be a very difficult one with things that we don't typically talk about. I would like everyone in the audience, as well as panelists, to be mindful of the fact that we are going to be hearing things that we are not familiar with, things that we may not necessarily think about, but I will invite everyone to be respectful and to understand that people talking about misconceptions on their story and not understanding it or not practicing it doesn't mean that their story is not valid. So let's try to be as kind to each other, to the panelists, as we can. Let's try to be as respectful as we can to each other and to the panelists, so that in the end, we have a conversation that will promote unity, that will promote solidarity. And that's the main goal for tonight's discussion. And as we see it in America, on the land of Native Americans, we recognize where we are sitting, but we also want to invoke our ancestors, our African ancestors, our African American ancestors who endured the most brutal treatment that anyone on planet Earth could ever endure. But still, they fought hard. They did refuse to give up, and they made it possible for somebody like myself to be living in America today and to have a better treatment than they ever did receive when they were fighting. We invoke those ancestors to guide us tonight through this difficult discussion, this difficult conversation. We are one people. We aim to become more united. If at the end of tonight's discussion or conversation, two Black kids at a school can get along better, support each other, watch each other's back, instead of tearing each other's down, I think our mission tonight is accomplished. So I wanted to thank everyone for being here tonight, and I'll let Bernard say a word. And Bernard, you're up next.
Thank you, Etienne. So the agenda for tonight, you will hear from each panelist. I will be speaking first. And then we will leave time for some responses, could be rebuttal or whatever response to what each, if any one of the panelists wants to respond to something that was said by another panelist, we will leave time for that. And then the last part of tonight's panel discussion will be where you, the audience, could chime in with questions and comments. And we encourage you to send us your questions, comments as we begin this panel discussion, and not wait to the end where you might forget what it was. So at any point you have a question or comment, send that in the chat room, and we won't have time for all of the questions, but we will try to hit as many as possible. So let me begin as the first panelist, and let me begin my presentation. So I want to begin with the question of what it means to be an African American or Black. I begin by saying the term Black and African American have several frames of reference by which they can be connoted. After explaining some conceptual issues, I will end by explaining why I think the divide between some Africans and African Americans exists. Let me start with the term Black and quickly point out that when it is connoted from the fixed context of biology rather than ethnicity, it obviously applies to all the members of this panel. Specifically, here the term Black is couched in having a specified set of common genes expressed and exemplified by people living in the African continent since time immemorial. Since all humans are biologically rooted in and from Africa, every white person and every other person listening and watching this panel discussion should come to terms with the fact that they too are genotypically in part Black. And let me say a couple of things as a footnote here. All humans are, in a hardcore scientific sense, Africans. A human is anyone who belongs to the genus Homo, which in Latin means man. One of the earliest known humans is Homo habilis, who lived about 2.4 million years ago in Eastern and Southern Africa. Modern humans from Africa traveled out of Africa and mated with European Neanderthals, which were like modern humans, but they were a lot bigger and stockier. And this was around 70,000 years ago. What's interesting is that an article written in the journal Cell of this year, 2020, showed that there's evidence that modern humans across the continent of Africa right now carry a significant amount of Neanderthal DNA in them, Africans now. And that suggests that there was a back and forth going on between Africa and what we call Europe back at earlier when this migration occurred, which means that Africans have European genetic makeup in them as well. So all humans are in fact African in a scientific sense. Despite the overused phrase that race is a social construct, to be sure, there are objectively genetic differences among Europeans, Africans, Asians, in terms of skin tone, hair texture, eye shape and color. But when we look at all the full genomes from people all over the world, those genotypical differences represent a tiny fraction of the differences between races of people. There is, for instance, more genotypical diversity within Africa than in the rest of the world put together. So for example, someone from Ethiopia and someone from Sudan, they are more likely to be more genotypically different from any other person on planet Earth, okay? But when we talk about the word Black biologically and who the word denotes, we are concerned with phenotype. In other words, the observable common features or family family features of humans called Black based on their genes, in part. Phenotype means a little bit more than that, but that's where we're going to go. And with all this talk about genetics, most Blacks in the United States whose ancestors were brought over to the continent from Africa do vary from their African cousins in phenotypical ways. This is due to the misfortunes of European chattel slavery, particularly the colonial sexual assaults on African slaves. As a personal note here, I like to point out that I did the Ancestry.com test about a couple of years ago, and I discovered that I have 32% Cameroon, Congo blood in me, 27% Ivory Coast blood, or let me start over again. That's 32% Cameroon and Congo, 13% Ivory Coast, 27% British, 13% Irish. So that makes me 44% African and 40% European. And I said, oh, that's quite interesting there. But in a way, I'm not surprised given the history of African Americans in this country. The high degree of exterior diversity within Blacks in the United States is not sufficient to rule out a basis for denoting a common denominator between them and the African Blacks. This, to specify the definition of Blackness in a biological sense that was given earlier in this paper presentation, I want to say a person, as I'm defining, a person is Black in a biological sense in virtue of their phenotype for Black skin and other phenotypical features common among people indigenous to Africa. When we turn our attention to the term African American in a biological sense, there's not much more to say. African Americans are just an instance or subcategory of people who are called Black when we talk about biology. So Nigerians and Ethiopians and so forth are also subcategories of people who are called Black in a biological sense. When the term Black and African American are used in an ethnic sense, in a cultural sense, they are synonymous terms. So when someone is referring to Black in a cultural sense, it means the same thing as African American. Okay, and they refer to and denote Blacks who, one, let me point this out, one, who were born in the United States. What I mean by, when I say African American Black in a cultural sense, it would be a person born in the United States, and two, whose socialization is a product of the culture of Blacks indigenous to the United States. This culture is rooted in the experiences of Blacks who faced slavery and Jim Crowism, but rooted also in the beautiful achievements of these Blacks despite and because of slavery and Jim Crowism. What all this said about the term Black and African American as ethnicity and biology, many Blacks in a biological sense, in subtle and not so subtle ways, go out of their way to disassociate themselves from being correctly or incorrectly identified as African Americans in both a cultural or biological sense. So now that we talk about the conceptual distinctions between the word Black and African American, I want to turn our attention to why people are worked up so much about being called African American or being mistaken for African American and all of that. How often has an African immigrant been emphatic about being classified for what he truly is, a non-African American? How often has an African American, whether he was born and raised in Winnetka, that's a very affluent white community, or in Seattle, Washington, been emphatic about seeing nothing positive about African American culture and wants to have an affinity towards white America in terms of their beliefs, values, and behavior? How often has a biracial person, a biracial American, been emphatic by not being called or being mistaken for an African American, which I find puzzling because biracial people come in all shapes and colors. And particularly in my own family, given the history I reported, you may refer to my family members as biracial because they're much, much lighter than I am, but we both have Black parents. So what's the disdain for being mistaken for African American? Is there something disgusting about being mistaken for African American? How often do all these Blacks, African or African American, who undeniably have Black blood in them, go out of their way to escape as far away from Blacks, both culturally and physically? For them to be successful as a Black person in this country is to escape Blackness as much as possible in both a biological and an ethnic cultural sense. For them, success lies in assimilating into whiteness, if not in terms of proximity by being with whites, or at least in terms of culture, identifying with their culture in either a conscious or unconscious way. Not only does this disdain for African Americans explode outward when Blacks, whether African or African American, seek to escape from being African Americans, it also implodes into the African American community. This implosion is best described as a cynicism within the African American community, a negative attitude about anything American, African American, and is displayed by a sense of distrust and pessimism. This cynicism is a deadly virus in the African American community. If an African American, for example, open an ice store in the African American community, they would say the ice is not cold enough. If he or she open up a store that sold sugar, they would say the sugar is not sweet enough, which makes no sense at all. And then they will in turn not buy from that Black salesperson and go out to a white community. Many in the African American community are aware of these expressions of disdain for African Americans. Unsettled as they are about this disdain, they counterpunch and despise any display of behavior or preference that ostensibly smacks of whiteness. How often have you heard an African American accuse another African American of talking or acting white? So this response, this counterpunch, is to say that because of all that, I'm going to punch back and have a disdain and a disgust for anything that sounds white, supposedly. So talking so-called white or acting white or even getting an education is deemed white. And this is a very self-destructive response. It falsely conflates whiteness with pursuits that are objectively valuable, like education.
Bernard, you have 1 minute left.
Okay. When we understand history, it is not surprising why this cycle, is that 10 minutes, Etienne? 10 minutes? Is that what you're saying, within 10 minutes? Okay. Yes. When you understand history, it is not surprising why this psychological civil war is played out among and between African Americans and Africans. And since I have just 1 minute, I would just wrap this up by saying that it's because many, for example, Africans who migrate to this country, this is not a problem for all Africans, but for some. And so if they migrate to this country and by chance or whatever the means are, assimilate into white America, they start to adopt white America ways where they do things like they operate from a white American toolbox, which means that they value rugged individualism. They deny structural problems that account for the social economic disparities in the Black community. And they don't see color. They don't see skin color or what's called color blindness. As a footnote here, I would highly recommend that you Google the word or phrase abstract liberalism, which is the face of modern day racism. So with that said, that Africans and African Americans who assimilate into white America, they adopt that worldview, that attitude, and that's why that disdain exists for Africans and African Americans. Now, if you are an African that comes to this country and you have this attitude, it's not like the reasons why the socioeconomic disparities exist. It's because of institutional racism against African Americans in terms of why so many are in prison, why education is so undervalued, or why it's so poor in the Black communities. So what happens for an African, for example, who—
Bernard, you've passed your time.
Okay, let me just give me 30 seconds here and I'll just say this here, that why do they not do anything if they know what these problems are? One is because they say, well, white people won't mistake me for being African American because of what I wear or how I talk and so forth. So that's the African Americans' problem. For African Americans, why they don't do anything? Because if you're fish in water, you won't see that you're operating from a white narrative. I'll stop there. And our next speaker is Keya, and she's going to give a presentation next.
Thank you, Bernard. Hello, my name is Keya, and I'm originally from Somalia. I came to this country when I was 12 years old. And I want to talk about my personal experiences and talk about why Africans distinguish from Americans and some of the conflicts from my personal experiences. Since I came to this country as a 12-year-old, I didn't even know I was Black. I mean, I never knew the term Black applied to me because I always thought I was African, Somali, brown, but never thought of Black and white because that was not something I knew. So I was taught by a friend of mine who was sitting next to me for the first time, who told me that I was African American. I mean, she said, I'm sorry, I'm Black, or considered myself African American. And I said, no, I don't think I'm African American because my family just came. We didn't get the paperwork to be Americans yet. And the fact when she said, I'm Black, I was like, wow, I thought I was brown, but I guess I'm Black. And she ended up telling me that she was not Chinese, which I assumed that she was Chinese, she was Hmong. So that's when I was introduced, and that's how I learned. And from personal experience in middle school, if I always felt I was different, that I wasn't, I'm not African American, so I thought I was different than them because I came from Somalia. We have different cultures, we have different religion, and all I knew was what I've been taught by or saw on the media. And everything from movies, from news, all the misconception, stereotype, I've learned it from there. So a lot of my community, I feel, when they come to this country, first, we are very misinformed about the historical context of African Americans. A lot of us know that they were slaves that were brought to this country, but beyond that, unless we're educated, a lot of us do not know the extent history of African American, the systemic racism that happens until we find ourselves in the same shoes. But because of the political climate now, a lot of Africans, and like I myself, who is a mother of two boys, I'm very worried because the same issues that happens to African Americans happens to us. We are dealing with the same card that they're dealing with. So a lot of us want to learn more, and that's why I wanted to be in this panel. So the misconception, the stereotypical things that I've learned over the years is that African Americans are, thugs, they're thieves, stay away from them, they're gangs. And similar misconception about Africans are we're backwards. Africa is considered the dark continent. So we're just people from, lives in, huts. We don't wear clothes. We are, primitive, backwards. And so those are the African misconceptions people have. So I've even heard those terms by some of my, when I was going through high school. I've heard people say that, hey, you guys don't even have TV. You don't wear clothes. You live in jungles. And so, so a lot of these misconceptions are all from the colonial period and slavery. I mean, white supremacy, I'm sorry, not slavery, white supremacy. And so I feel like even though slavery is over, the mindset and the psychological impact has not been gone. It sips through it. And a lot of Africans, when they come here, we don't want to integrate. We built our own communities where we are so collective society, where we want to, be around people that look like us. So a lot of us do not reach out to the African American communities. So therefore, we don't know much about them. We only know what we hear and what we see, and we learn all these misconceptions and assumptions, and we make our own assumptions meanwhile. So that's the reason I think a lot of us a lot of us are scared to have these conversations. And they're uncomfortable. And some Africans, when they move to these countries, they leave something behind. So now when they come here and they get the opportunity to get a job, buy a house, and they feel like the success is on their side, they want to move away from the cities, away from the Black communities, because we are being taught that being around African Americans is going to impact your life, and they're not good people. So there's all these assumptions and myths that we consume over the years, makes us, and we act like we're the white people. So we are acting like we are operating on the white mentality, basically. So the conflict, that's what creates the conflict, the misconception and the stereotypes, and not reaching out. So I think if now we know that we are all Americans, we're here, we're not going anywhere. We should same things are applying, we're operating on the same systems. So we need to find a way to have these conversations, brave conversations, and talk about these myths, and us holding on to ethnicity. We need to, in order for us to move on, I think what we need to do is be ethnicity traders. And that's how the white people, I feel, got the power. They were, they were Italians, they were Irish, but they decided to leave all that so they could have more power and dominate a group. So the mentality that we have consumed over the years, it's making us cripple. And it's not giving us the opportunity, and we're not able to have these conversations. And as Africans, when we move here and we just want to succeed, and then move away from the African Americans, not knowing that the reason why we're here as Africans and other immigrants, color immigrants that come here, is because of the civil rights movement. So we think we have the mentality first when we come to this country that the white men rescued us. The white man is the savior. And so when we have that mentality, we continue to operate on that mentality. So I want us to have these conversations, talk about personal experiences. I struggled in high school with my African American friends. I was spit on several times. We got into fights because they called me the African booty scratcher, or, you stink, or things like that. And when, you're a teenager and you're young, all these hormones, and I didn't have the background of the African American history, I was just angry. And I was like, I don't want to deal with them because they are operating this way. That means that all these negative myths, that stereotypes, it is true. And so I stayed away from them. And I
we have 1 minute left.
I grabbed towards making friends with white people because I felt like they were nicer to me. But I was young, I was misinformed. And I am ready to have these brave conversations. And thank you so much for everybody who's joining us. These are my experiences. I have more experiences, but I only have 1 minute left. So I would leave it as we need to find ways to have these conversations and talk and reach out to our communities, because at the end of the day, we have the same struggles. We're all Black people. We are being systematically oppressed the same way, and same things that happens to African Americans happens to us. And if a white man saw me today, besides my scarf, if I did not wear my scarf and I had my hair out, I'm still African American to them. So there's no distinguish between Africans and African Americans. So thank you so much. And the next panel is Keya.
Hi, everyone. My name is Keya Stanford. I am a registered nurse. I graduated from Howard University in 2012, and I'm currently in Oklahoma right now doing a COVID assignment. I am so thankful to CTV, Etienne, and Bernard, and the rest of the panelists, for inviting me to come and share my experiences between African and African Americans. So I just want to start off by saying that colonization of the world really, really, really shapes how we feel about ourselves and about each other. So we know that several countries, Brits, French, colonized different parts of Africa, and then Africans were brought over through slavery, also known as human trafficking, to America and treated as property. And a lot of the psychological aspects that African Americans have today stem from that era. So I know there's stereotypes of African Americans being poor and lazy and welfare recipients and criminals and selling drugs and unable to hold jobs and having a bunch of kids. And so a lot of people come to America, particularly Africans, I would say, come to America and don't want to be associated with those stereotypes. And I don't blame them. I don't want to be associated with those stereotypes because they're not all entirely true. And many of them were propagated by the dominant society in order to make African Americans think and look at themselves as being less than. And I believe that now is the time for that thinking to stop. African Americans can look at Africans and think, oh, they're bougie and they are very arrogant because they know where they come from and how dare they walk around like this and they have all this education and they don't have it hard like us, because to America, a foreigner, it doesn't matter what you are particularly, a foreigner is deemed more desirable to give money to start businesses. And when certain people come over, they'll buy land or they'll start businesses with their families. Everybody will live together and put money in a pot. And then, okay, we're all going to own this store. And then when we get this amount of money, we'll give you money and you start your store down the street. And those things take place within foreign communities. Whereas in America, the African Americans are still trying to rise above just being looked at as property. So I just want to take a step back and talk about race and ethnicity, right? So race, to the dominant society, they see everybody by their skin color. So when I looked it up today on iowadatacenter.org, just to make sure I knew the difference between race and ethnicity, race was deemed as the color of people's skin. So there's like 5 races in America, right? African American / Alaska Native, Asian, Native American / other Pacific Islander, white, and then you have Black and African American. All of the other races on that website were written as a person having origins in any of the original peoples of insert location, Hawaii, England, this, that, and the third. But the Black and African American definition states that it's a person having origins in any of the Black racial groups of Africa, not an origin of people. They didn't even write people in that definition. So if the society is not looking at me as a person, they're going to put me into societal standards and stereotypes as something other than human. So if you look at the way that Black men, African American men, are painted in the media, thugs, criminals, all of these things that I've already stated, then if anything happens to us, such as getting shot on camera in front of millions of people, society at a standard won't think anything of it because, oh, we already know that they're criminals. Oh, it's just another criminal getting, what's due to him. And that has to stop. With what Hawaii was saying about Africans and African Americans coming together, like that's something that really needs to happen, because we all know the old standard of war. You divide and conquer, divide, create division between the masses. When you create division, you can't stand together, right? So America has this thing that they say, united we stand, divided we fall. They have used that on us and have divided us against each other. And it's time that we come together. So we have to get over the Africans are stuck up, the African Americans are poor, they don't have money, they don't know how to do this. There was a woman from Nigeria that was braiding my hair, and we were having a great conversation. And she was telling me that her high school teacher told her that if she attended university in America, that it would be okay for her to marry an American, just do not a Black American, because they are dangerous. Because they're dangerous. I'm sorry to get emotional, but I just have to say this. African Americans are not dangerous. Do you know who's dangerous? The people who divide and conquered the land. The people who stole the land with murder. Those people are dangerous. The ones that still are saying that if you don't go to school and you don't do this and you don't do this and you don't do that, then you're worth nothing. Those people are very dangerous. So it's time that we go past the stereotypes. We get in touch with our brothers and sisters of the Pan-Africa diaspora and really learn who we are. Because there have been times that I felt disconnected because I didn't know where my family came from. And the reason I didn't know where my family came from in Africa is because they were human trafficked over here and records were not kept for specific reasons. Because when you don't know who you are and where you come from, you will fall for anything. And as time has gone on, I've gotten to know African brothers and sisters and adopted some of their familiar standards, and not this American me, mine, I gotta have this, I gotta have a house, a car, 2.5 kids, white house, picket fence, and a dog maybe. I'm looking to have those interconnected relationships with people throughout the diaspora, so that way I can know who I am, and then we can fortify each other. So some of the similarities that we have is that we're all beautiful shades of melanin. We all like our jewelry. we all age very gracefully, and we care a lot about our family's well-being. And some of the differences in education that I found is that in America, at least for myself, I was deemed a gifted child. I was smart. And so as the years gone on in elementary school, I was in classes with a lot of Black kids, a lot of white kids. Then when I went to middle school, it was maybe me and 25 other white kids. Then when I went to high school, it was me and 27 other white kids, and maybe a Black boy or a Hispanic girl, never both, in the classroom. And then when you go down to the next level of intelligence, it's half and half. And then you go to the lowest level of intelligence and it's all Black and then a couple white poor kids. And this is the system of America. When you find someone that is Black, that you deem smart, gifted, all of those things, you take them out of their community and separate them so that way they can't enrich the others around them. And it's time that stops. I mean, I don't mind people like, oh, you're a really smart child, we really, really want to educate you, but don't just do it for that one child. There was a teacher that I had in English, my English teacher, and she told me—
Yeah, you have 1 minute left.
Okay, thank you. She told me that we had to write a 10-page paper. And I asked her, okay, that's fine, but what about the next class down? Remember, I said half and half, Black and white. Oh, they only have to write 5 pages. Then the next class down, mostly Black kids. How many pages do they have to write? And she told me, oh, only 1 page. And I said, why is that? Why do they only have to write 1 page? Oh, well, because we can't put too much on them. They won't be able to do it. And then I don't want to have to fail them. And I said, do you know that when you give people standards that they rise to it? And she looked at me like, wow, I can't believe you said that. So I am hoping that this conversation allows us to realize when you set certain standards for yourself and your community, they will rise to it. United we stand, divided we fall, and it's time for us to stand together. Thank you. The next panelist we have is Leon.
Thank you, Keya. Good evening, everyone, all our viewers tonight. My name is Leon Rodrigues. I grew up in South Africa. I regard myself as having been of the African soil, born and raised in South Africa. And I moved to the United States to do my graduate education in 1995. And so I've been in the United States for approximately a quarter of a century. I raised my children here who were all African, including my wife. Many of the experience Keya and Hawiya have shared, I can so resonate with being an African coming to the United States. but I do want to share with you tonight a personal experience, my first connection to the African American community, and also my own ignorance of the African American community. Now, I was aware of the music, aspects of the culture, but also all of the negative ways in which Hollywood had portrayed African Americans in my home country. So I too entered this society from a stereotypical perspective of African Americans, including the names, the derogatory names that African Americans were called, because that is what we learn when we live abroad about African Americans in the United States. My very first encounter with an African American was a friend that was introduced to me. His name was Melvin Giles, and we became really close friends. He was just the kindest person. He was so excited to meet me and my family. And when we visited his home, he had a picture of Dr. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and Nelson Mandela. And I was so excited to see that. Melvin invited my family and myself to travel with him to Chicago. And we were very excited to be able to see another American city. We were also very curious because he told us that they were holding a family reunion, like tonight's title. I had never experienced a family reunion, so it was very exciting to figure out what this meant. So we drove to Chicago, and as we were driving to Chicago, Melvin began telling me about cities that were very racist and where it was unsafe for Black people to even sometimes stay overnight. There was one city in particular that he pointed out where he said, this is the city where we only stop at the gas station, get gas, and you keep going. I was very accustomed to racial segregation and also to racist acts, but I did not expect it to be as blatant in the American experience. I thought it was far back in the American history. Nevertheless, we traveled to Chicago and we met Melvin's family, and we had just a wonderful time with his family. They were very eager to know more about South Africa, and we were very eager to know about their experiences. And as the day progressed, we noticed many similarities between our culture and that of the African Americans. Now, I think you're all aware that both, as Bernard pointed out, genealogical studies and DNA studies that have been done that show that African Americans and Africans are, even though dissimilar from a DNA perspective, still part of the same family. And so the family that we were visiting spoke a lot about that. They kept referring to the continent where I am from as the motherland, which gave me a great sense of affinity. Then they talked about the civil rights struggle and invited my opinion, since I had just gone through the South African civil rights struggle. We found that there were many commonalities in the freedom songs that we sang, in the way in which we were beaten by the police, how we were whipped, and how dogs were set upon us to control protest marches and to suppress our desire for freedom. Throughout the day, I noticed the following about the African American culture: the respect for elders and others. People were referred to as brother and sister, much like my own family does. Children showed reverence to adults, referring to them as uncle and aunt, and they called me Mr. Leon. The food was similar to our home cooking, except for the gumbo, which they admitted was new to them as well, because they had a new son-in-law who was from Louisiana. Also, my first introduction to gumbo. They did not waste food. They were wrapping up food parcels for people to take home, just like my own family. Children were treated with love, and those who were disobedient got a good talking to while showing remorse, just like my own family. They looked like many of my aunts, uncles, and cousins and people in the neighborhood that I grew up in. They kept talking about their yearning and their desire to go to the motherland. One thing that truly intrigued me, even though I was not surprised, was that they referred to themselves as Black people. I was accustomed to that. For those of us who grew up in racialized societies, we know what that concept means. But for many Africans, that can be a very shocking reality. And I was in graduate school with others from different African countries, and they resented being called Black. One of my colleagues, a Bible professor, always said, "I hate being called Black." Another colleague said, "I hate this term, people of color." But that is the identity that is conferred on us as we engage in a racialized society. And that is how a racialized white superstructure relegates us to an inferior position. And that is exactly what I experienced in South Africa. So, from what you heard from the others, and I'll just add my 2 cents, first of all, is we make judgments on very superficial nomenclature. Like an iceberg, we only see the top 10%. And yet, there's so much depth beneath that. If it wasn't for my engagement with Melvin and his family, I would have maintained my own stereotypes, my own stereotypical view of African Americans. Much like the video documentary called The Lost Boys of Sudan, where these boys are being prepared to come to the United States. And the village elders have this big celebration for them. And they live in a very remote part of Sudan.
Leon, you have 1 minute.
Yet one of the village elders says to these boys who had been roaming in the desert for a long time and were now being brought to the United States as refugees, he says, "And don't get mixed up with those people with the baggy pants," which I literally translated as, "Don't associate with African Americans." How did these village elders know that? Already those boys were consciously being prepared to avoid African Americans. And that is what I found in a lot of my encounters and experiences, was that African Americans are socially, politically, and even economically relegated to a lower caste position in this society. Thank you, Etienne.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. My name is Mankpondehou Etienne Djevi. I am originally from Benin, West Africa. It used to be the Kingdom of Dahomey. With colonization, a part of it got and became part of Togo. But here we are today. In the year 2020, when Black people wearing Black Lives Matter sign make people to be so angry to the point of perhaps wanting to shoot. What is my responsibility? What is my obligation to my Black brother or to my Black sister? I think this is the way I'm going to approach this. If in 2020, just saying that our lives matter caused people to be so angry, I get to do a self-reflection and see how I can lift my brother and my sister up. I came to the United States in 2006, and like Brother Leon talked about and Sister Huea talked about, we grew up knowing only bad things about Black America. It's drug, it's gangs, it's poverty. And I remember when I came to this country and was studying to go back to medicine, one of the lecturers used to talk about, in behavioral science, used to talk a lot about drug, gang, poverty, HIV, diabetes, all things negative, mostly in the Black community. But what was never talked about was why. I kept trying to hear why those things were the way they were, but the why never came. So when you grow up hearing only negative things about a certain group of people, and you move to where they live, you do your best not to associate with them until you start to know that this is just not true. I happen to, know African Americans who are doctors, who are nurses, who are professional working every day. But if you grow up in Africa, you probably never hear that. And if you move here and stay in your own community, you don't get to necessarily get out of that bubble based on misconception. What is the rationale, what is the basis for this misconception? And it's colonization. The colonization that says, for example, that white people can stay in Bruxelles and divide Africa the way they wanted, to the point that the Ewe people are now in 3 different countries. The same conception that tells the African kid to not embrace his name, his African name. We are not supposed to, especially when you go to school, you're not supposed to embrace your African name. You're supposed to have the white man name. And that's how your teacher's supposed to call you. That's how your peers are supposed to call you. Even your parents, even if they didn't go to school, will try to call you by your white man name as opposed to your African-born name. I think that's part of where this kind of misconceptions start. And if you come here, you don't do the work of trying to understand and trying to get out of those bubbles, you try to not associate necessarily with Blackness. When I first moved here, I had an experience that was quite shocking to me, especially that it came from a Black brother. I was working at a place where every time I go to work, this guy will just be kind of rude to me and will ask me if I started wearing clothes when I moved to America, if I used to eat any food in America, if I used to live in the jungle, and it was just quite impressive in a bad way. And I tried to have a discussion with my limited English at the time, and it was just not going anywhere. To the point that when I went back a few years later, I had to take pictures of Africans living in Africa to come show him and say, yeah, we don't live in trees. We live in houses just like everyone else. It may not be as fancy, but that was a really eye-opening moment for me, but one that did not necessarily define how I view my African American brothers and sisters going forward. Because if I go to a conference and walk into a conference room, the first thing I do is scan the room and see, is there any other Black brother there? Is there any other Black sister there? And I'm pretty sure a lot of people do that. And I think part of the reason we do that is this sense that we don't want to be alone. This sense that we want somebody to be watching our back. So that, and I will usually, if there's a break, you can easily find the 2 or 3 brothers and sisters in the room chatting just to connect. So we have this easy way of connecting that it's usually, I think, a defense mechanism of let's stick together, even if from time to time we don't necessarily behave that way. I practice infectious disease in the East Metro, and it has happened to me a couple of times that, I mean, quite often discrimination against a Black doctor is not uncommon. But when it comes from a brother or a sister, it just brings the pain to a different level. And I had this a couple of times, but one experience that was like, I don't want you to take care of me because you're from Africa and you're not well educated. And that came from a brother. And I would say that was really the first time that in face of discrimination working as a doctor, that was the only time that I actually cried because of that pain. But I would say the majority of the patient of color, especially Black patient, African-American patient I take care of, view me as somebody who has their back, somebody who has the best interest in my heart.
1 minute, Etienne.
Okay. So it is important that as we go forward in a world that does not put a whole lot of value in our lives, that we take care of each other, that we watch each other's back. And one way I do this at work is I'm going to stop by and say hi to everyone, especially the people who are not seen. The lab tech, the janitor, the house cleaner, those people do extremely important work, but don't even get the sense that they are seen, that they exist. And I pay extremely good attention to stopping by to say hi to them. If there's anything I can do to lift you up in 1 second, I will be happy to do that. And how do we as the Black community try to lift each other up for a better unity, for a better solidarity, for better support.
That's 2 minutes.
So I hope we finish the discussion tonight by, inviting people to connect, to know each other at a personal level for a better unity. Thank you. And I think Sam is up next.
Thank you very much for this opportunity for all of us to come and have this dialogue about this important issue. I'm going to approach it a little bit differently, but before I do that, I would like to say that I come into this conversation in a very interesting way because I was planning to leave Nigeria in 1993 to come to the University of Minnesota to begin my graduate studies. And I remember there was a guy in the school I was teaching, which was a school of agriculture, who warned me that when I come to this country, I should avoid African Americans. He went to school at the Ohio State University. Amazingly, on the eve of my departure, I got a letter from, because I was sponsored by the MacArthur program at the University of Minnesota. So I got a letter from a person who is in the MacArthur program. He's an African-American. He's now a professor at American University in the Department of Government. So he wrote me this letter telling me that when I arrive, he would like us to be roommates. And this is very unusual, especially given the fact that I was told that I should avoid African Americans when I come here. But I was very open-minded. And there are a lot of things that helped me apart from the courage of that my friend to write me. I will talk about it later. But I grew up as a minority in northeastern Nigeria. So I'm used to being a subaltern in that sense. So anyway, I came to the United States and we became roommates with my friend who is a political scientist. And we worshiped in an African-American church for some time together, which was very, very interesting to me because unlike many Africans who come here and never have an opportunity to maintain a very close relationship with an African-American, in my case, the moment I arrived, I had an African-American as my roommate. We're almost the same age, and we engaged in very open conversations. And it was through him that I came to understand a lot about I started developing interest about the African-American community. And then subsequently, of course, when I started teaching, because of my relationship with him, I just felt like in all my courses, I was interested in looking at the African-American experience because to me, that was very, very important. So that was how I came into this conversation. It's very, very special to me because of that relationship that I established with him. But there are three things I want to quickly go through. First and foremost, I think I want to frame our conversation as part of a much larger conversation about what it means to be human and what do we owe each other for being human. Because some of these things that we're talking about with regard to the relationship between African immigrants and African Americans, actually from my studies, I found out that there's something deeper we have to look at. Because if you look at the way, even within the United States, sometimes there are scholarship indicating that some African Americans are seeing themselves as brokers. That's just within the community. They're seeing themselves as brokers. They have left the other group of African Americans behind. William Julius Wilson has written quite a lot about the division within the African American community. And then there's this documentary produced by Henry Louis Gates titled The Two Nations of Black America, where you see all these things. But then within Africa itself, I don't think it should even be surprising that we have this kind of problems understanding each other, because I come from Nigeria and I see a lot of this misunderstanding. And I've been thinking about it really very seriously. So if within Nigeria, you have this kind of misunderstanding between ethnic groups or whatever, then you have to look deeper and ask yourself, what is it among ourselves as human beings that is leading to that? And moreover, what also complicated my way of thinking is that when I was an undergraduate, I got this guy from Ghana who taught us social theory. And he introduced me to this whole French Revolution, the Agricultural Revolution, the Scientific Revolution. And I read it, I remember, when I was an undergraduate. And it was very impressed on me that white people can just treat each other like trash, because when you read the French Revolution, you see this very, very clearly. So I came here not knowing very much, or if anything, about African Americans, but I also know that, having read the French Revolution, that being white does not immune you from treating another, even white person, in a very terrible way. So the first thing that I want to address, having said that, is why do some Africans make a point to distinguish themselves from African Americans in the United States? Well, some of you have already mentioned this, but I would just like to emphasize the fact that there's a book written by J.M. Blau titled The Colonizer's Model of the World. If you read that book, you will see how, for instance, he argues that one of the turning points in world history is European colonization of other parts of the world. And for instance, in that book, he said, one of the legacies of this colonization is that there are core countries and there are peripheral countries. So those of us who come from Africa, or those people who come from Latin America or Asia, are considered to be peripheral countries. And what are their characteristics? Their characteristics are, they can only imitate, they are irrational, they are very emotional, they are instinctive, they can only engage in concrete thought, empirical thought, practical reasoning, body and matter. They are very spontaneous, they are childish, they are insane, they practice sorcery, stagnation. These are the kind of characteristics associated with people in the periphery. What about those people in the core, which means the Western part of the world? Well, they are very inventive, they are rational, they are very intellectual, they can engage in abstract thought, theoretical reasoning, mind, they emphasize the mind, they are very disciplined, they are like adults, they have sanity, they can engage in science and progress. So this is the way the world is divided. And I'm sorry to tell you that up to now, there's still some elements of that, okay? The difference between African Americans and Africans is that, in spite of the fact of slavery or whatever, if an African American would see an African in a certain way, it's not the African American per se, but it is the legacy of all this, as some of you have already highlighted, okay? We live in an environment where our categories of mediation, what do I mean by categories of mediation? Categories of mediation means the way we come to understand the world and ourselves. We don't have the power to do that. It is through language. And this language is not owned by any one of us, right? So if you ask me, who am I? All the vocabularies that I'm going to use, the concepts I'm going to use to describe who I am, these categories of mediation are not created by me. So in other words, both African Americans and Africans, when we try to understand ourselves and relate to each other, we are mediating, the concepts that are mediating our relationship are concepts that we have no control over. And please try to understand, let's understand that this is not just a problem between us. If you read the history of this country, there are other Europeans who equally treated each other like that, okay? Like Italians, they were treated very bad. So I want us to look at this even more broadly. It happens in stages, but it's not just us, but it's like, there's something St. Augustine in the City of God called libido dominandi, this lust to conquer, to dominate, okay? So this is what is really happening here. And all of us, as Leon indicated, we are living in a racialized society. And then when we come, we just absorb that. So the second point I would like to make is, what are the conflicts between—
You have about a minute left.
Okay, what are the conflicts between, well, let me just leave that and just go to the last question, the question of solidarity. In my view, what are the points of solidarity between Africans and African Americans? Well, in my opinion, solidarity between any group of people requires a cultivation of a series of a sense of shared humanity, social liberation, and transcendence. And what do I mean by that? Insofar as we live in a society where success comes through competition, and as a result of competition, there are going to be winners and losers. Unless we liberate ourselves, we are never going to go anywhere. The white community in the United States itself cannot liberate itself insofar as the idea is competition. There's a book written recently that came out, Death of Despair, where the largest number of suicide committed in the United States are by white, non-college educated people. It has brought down life expectancy of the people in this country. These are white people, but the mainstream white society is not even taking care of them. Okay, so we need this liberation, because the reason why they are not taken care of is because the system is structured in such a way that the people who are doing well there, and then the others are left behind. So the point I just want to emphasize here is that without liberating ourselves, social liberation, without transcendence, without a sense of shared humanity, we're not going to go anywhere, because I'll be seeing myself. I'm concerned about accumulating, and in the process, I see all of you probably as obstacles to my accumulation, or I just engage in transactional relationship with you, which means I will only relate to you if I think I'm going to get something from you. Any one of us who's going to behave like that is not actually someone who has experienced social liberation. Social liberation is not just external, but internally, I have to liberate myself to understand that we have a shared humanity, and that should be the foundation of our relationship. Thank you very much.
Preach, Sam, preach. Preach.
Thank you very much.
Yes. First of all, thank you, Sam. I feel like the hitter who comes up to the plate right after a ball player's just hit a grand slam home run. I am Dr. Timothy Holly. I'm an associate professor of music at North Carolina Central University in Durham, North Carolina. I'm a native of Detroit, Michigan. And like Bernard, I am a product of the Great Migration, which was a late 19th, early and mid 20th century social phenomenon in which millions of African Americans migrated from the rural, racist, white supremacist southern United States to the north, to the northeast, and to the west. Isabel Wilkerson has written a Pulitzer Prize winning book titled The Warmth of Other Suns that chronicles that phenomenon from at least 3 different perspectives of experience. Again, since I know I have such a limited amount of time, I cannot possibly cover the entire waterfront in that limited time, but I will reserve my remarks for just to make maybe 2 points. The first point is in regard to the sense of family and connectedness between us all. And I can do that by way of a personal experience that I had several years ago as a member of the faculty at North Carolina Central University. I was teaching a course as a part of the general studies curriculum, and on one particular class day, I happened to get to class just a few minutes early, which is that's not the norm for me. Usually my students are waiting for me when I enter. And as I walked into the classroom, I sensed very quickly that I had walked in on the tail end of a very intense discussion. And just to give you a sense of how intense the conversation was, I'll tell you the statement that I heard as I walked in. And the statement sounded like this: "Well, you ain't my daddy." And here's the rest of the story that I learned after the fact. A gentleman who was older, that was from the African continent. I believe he was from either Nigeria or Ghana. He was having a conversation with a young African American woman, and I'll just cut to the chase. Neither of them were very tall. The gentleman was maybe 5 feet 5 inches tall. The young lady was probably 4 feet 9, 4 feet 10. She wouldn't make 5 feet in heels, let's put it that way. But they had both arrived at the class early, and the gentleman took it upon himself to politely admonish her, because he had noticed in earlier class meetings that she had not been paying attention, that she had been, well, this was back in the days when cell phones weren't quite as popular as they are now, so I don't think she was talking on a cell phone, but she was definitely distracted. And he had taken it upon himself to tell her, not ask, but to tell her that it would be in her better interest to pay undivided attention to Dr. Holly when he was delivering his lecture, no matter how well prepared I was or wasn't, or how coherent or incoherent I was sounding at a given time. But this young lady, challenged of height as she was, and I should also mention the fact that she was very dark skinned, which adds an additional dynamic to this whole conversation. You have two black folks talking, but they're not lining up on the same social or academic or emotional level. And so a verbal altercation ensued, shall we say. And the checkmate sentence that was said that ended the conversation was what I heard when I walked in that room. Well, you ain't my daddy. And I didn't even have time to laugh. One, because it wasn't quite funny at the moment. Now 10, 15 years later, oh, yeah, I certainly wouldn't tell that story at a cocktail party. But there is a certain mirth that all of us that have brown skin can relate to and process correctly, at least. And the more profound thing that I went away thinking after the fact was this notion of being connected, of being in family. I once, while active in social media, i.e. Facebook, like most of us are, around finals week, and again, Dr. Walker can relate to this, when you have, you're up to here in grades to figure out deadlines to meet. And I've used Facebook in perhaps the not so tactful way of blowing off some steam while reading finals. And a friend of one of my aunts read my comment, forwarded it on, I think she called my aunt. And then I got an email message from my aunt telling me about the Facebook post that I had shared, telling me, you should take that down. And I went to the post, gave it a second thought, took it down, and then called my aunt and told her, yes, Auntie, you were right. Thank you.
Again, you have a minute left.
Yeah, it's funny how quickly that went by. But that notion of being connected. With regard to this strange country we're living in now, I came across a excerpt that you are probably aware of. It's the writing of James Baldwin, and it's the part of the first chapter of his book, The Fire Next Time, in which he is talking to his nephew, who is also named James. And a number of sentences just jumped off the page at me. The first is, know whence you came. If you know whence you came, then there's really no limit to where you can go. The second sentence that jumped off the page at me, which is almost a paragraph, James Baldwin is talking about black and white relations, and he says, the black man has functioned in the white man's world as a fixed star, as an immovable pillar. And as he moves out of his place, heaven and earth are shaken to their foundations. You don't be afraid. I said it was intended that you should perish in this ghetto. Whether we're called thugs, and by the way, Dr. Walker, you and I can be called thugs. We just have university appointments, but we're still university thugs. Because we live in this world that was not created with our pursuit of happiness at the top of the agenda. But yet we still have to love those folks who don't care and only care about the status quo as it benefits them. I'll stop there before I run out of time anyway. Thank you so much. And I believe I must introduce Tobias next.
Thank you, brothers. This has been a great conversation. Appreciate everyone who has participated in it. I just want to do a quick time test here because I don't want to cut out our next panelist.
You're fine. You're fine.
We're fine for the 10?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. All right. Well, I wanted to look at a little more of the historical context for these relationships. I've been a missionary now for nearly 40 years, closer to 40 than 30 at this point. It's hard for me to believe that. But I've had the opportunity to live with various people groups from different parts of the world, including some of our Native American brothers on the Navajo, with the Navajo Nation. So that has helped to give me a broader context from a global perspective and look at a lot of similarities from culture to culture. And one of the things that I've noticed is just from a historical standpoint, trying to bring some context to these relationships, that's been helpful in terms of me gaining an understanding of what happens behind the scenes with these relationships from a historical standpoint. So I look at, for example, one of my personal experiences here. About 5 years ago, my pastor and I were doing a pastor's conference in the Congo. And being there in Africa, I've been there several times before. I packed pretty much all African garb, maybe one or two American pieces. But I found out at that conference that I was in a very small minority. Everyone was dressed in suits and ties. It was very hot. T-shirts, shirts, buttoned up, piece of material around the neck that we call ties, and a jacket on top of that. I was like, these African clothes are made for this temperature. Very comfortable. You have some that are just casual. You have some that are high-end dress. But I looked at that and I thought, wow, that's really interesting to see how our cultures have been denied us. Not only here in America, but on the continent of Africa itself. I was living in South Africa back in '94. I've made several trips to South Africa. One of the things I wanted to find when I was there was a good African church with African culture, African style preaching, storytelling, African dance, African instruments. I had a very hard time trying to find that. What I found was African European churches. And if they had a image of Jesus, it was a white Jesus. I was like, wow, that's pretty deep, right? All the way here in Africa, I'm trying to find some sort of cultural identity on the motherland, right? And what I'm finding is Europeanized Africa. Stemming back from colonization, Archbishop Desmond Tutu made the popular synopsis of colonization, European colonization, when he said, when the missionaries came, we had the land, they had the Bible. They taught us how to pray. We closed our eyes. When we opened our eyes, they had the land and we had the Bible. And that has been a part of that manifest destiny that Europeans have had that have gone over most of the globe. And what we find has emanated out of that is this sense of white superiority. And that can take place and runs from a psychological perspective, as a background app on a computer, so to speak. Whether or not we're aware of it or not, there is this racial implicit bias that tends to function in our minds. Now, for those who have been on the receiving end of racism, white supremacy, we've dealt with that from one perspective, from our experiences being on that receiving end. And then those who have been on the beneficiary end of that, they have had a different sort of perspective. And it's not monolithic on either side. There are those who have become allies to our cause, our Anglo brothers and sisters. And there are those who have perpetuated white supremacy in an aggressive manner. On the receiving end, we have those that have fought the fight and fought the power, and those who have also sought to assimilate into that culture. You know, as Malcolm talked about, the house slave mentality versus the field slave mentality. So we find those evident among us. It wasn't until 1681 that the term to categorize people of light skin, white was used in American law. Prior to that, people were separated and divided based upon their nationality, their religious belief, their economic status, etc. But it wasn't until after Bacon's Rebellion, 1676, 1677, to where that divide and conquer strategy was put into place. And whiteness came with a certain set of privileges. Not everyone that's considered white today was white back then. Irish are not considered white. The Italians were not considered white. And initially what would happen is that that could change from year to year. You could be considered white this year, your people group. The next year, you're not white. The following year, you might get that status again. But it came as something to be sought after because it had privileges that came along with it. And even today, when we look at the US Census, today, those in the Middle East that was at one time considered part of Africa, including Egypt, are now considered white. Well, there are people in the Middle East and in Egypt that are darker than me. Now, I can go anywhere in the United States and people will identify me as Black. But depending upon where you come from, you're now considered white, even though you may be darker in complexion. So the privileges that came along with whiteness is something that still is taking place today. So when we talk about our relationships with each other, with our African brothers and sisters, and people being told that maybe you shouldn't interact with these Black Americans, then there's a historical backdrop on that. So it's that forced assimilation. My name is Tobias. When I was a kid, my nickname that I went by was Toby. I used Toby up until Roots. And Roots came out, I was no longer Toby. So there has been that forced assimilation that has also come with punishment when we did not assimilate. You see, the missionary was trying to save the so-called savages. Those that converted and assimilated were then free to live. Then the military followed the missionaries and killed off those that could not be converted because they were seen as being dangerous. So even today, that mentality is in play, right? So unless you forcibly assimilate, deny your culture, and blend in and code switch by the type of hair that we wear, the type of clothing that we wear, the type of language that we speak and how we speak it, then there is always going to be that sense of punishment. I know many people who have worn their Samson locks like me, who have cut them off because they are looking for employment. That is an example of that punishment. It used to be public beatings. Now it's from a psychological perspective. Now you may not get that job. You may not get that loan. You may not get that. You may not qualify for that business loan or that home that you want. So there are consequences still for not forcibly assimilating. Our Native American brothers went through the same thing, you know. So there's a historical backdrop to all of that. And I just want to
ask you have a minute.
Thank you, brother. Just wanted to bring that up in this conversation, which I think it has many layers to it. It's a very deep psychology that is behind that. But we have to look at what we share in common, because we have more to gain by working together than we do being separated from each other. And the power structures recognize that. So thank you all for being a part of this, and I appreciate being able to join this discussion this evening. Next up is my brother, Yagasa. Hope I pronounced your name right, brother.
You pronounced it right enough. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Yagasa. I am very, very honored and privileged to have this opportunity to have this amazing and very important discussion with you all. Thank you, everyone who's tuning in from your homes for listening in to tackle these very important issues. I'm going to focus. Well, you know, I'm the last of the panelists, and that has its perks as well as its flaws. And one of the perks is that I get to sort of summarize what's been said. But the flaw, of course, is that I'm going to likely repeat a lot of things that's already been said. So I'm going to try to at least couch it in a way that's original and sounds a little different. But ultimately, I think we mostly sort of identify some of the same issues that sort of separate us and also unifies the people of African descent. And so I'm just going to kind of tackle two of the questions that were presented to us. The first question I want to address is this question on, solidarity. What unites Africans and people of African descent? And why do we bond with each other? And for me, what sort of helped me think about this question was Leopold Senghor's idea of nigritude. Leopold Senghor being the Senegalese poet and statesman, and his idea of nigritude, which was basically his attempt to really capture and articulate the essence of the Black personality, the essence of the Black spirit, essentially. And so Leopold Senghor identifies three things that unifies people of African descent. The first attribute is spirituality, how we understand and interact with the spirituality. Whereas in European culture, spirituality really distinguishes between the material world and the spiritual world, where there's this sort of perpetual desire or impetus to separate the spiritual world from like science, for instance. And when we see this in this imperative of removing the church from science, for example, and we see this even in our some of the values that we hold dear in the United States, for example, when we talk about separating church and state, for example. Whereas in traditional African culture, and that sort of distinction is not made, right? Because Africans generally see spiritual essence in everything that surrounds us. And so because of this, Africans, the notion of land ownership was very problematic when the colonials came in to Africa, actually, because the idea of owning land was just completely foreign to Africans, because again, land is imbued with spirituality. And so therefore, land is available for human use, but no one could actually possess land because again, it transcends any individual's capacity to own it. So that's one of the ways in which one of the features that Senghor argues unifies people of African descent. The second characteristic is the Black proclivity towards communalism. So in traditional European cultures, they really emphasize individualism, right? And we see this also even here in the U.S., which of course is a Western country by and large. When we talk about ideas like, pulling yourself up by your bootstrap, these ideas really harken back to really early European understandings of how society is structured and how individuals within society move and elevate through society. Whereas in African context, Africans and people of African descent tend to emphasize communalism a lot more, right? The imperative to sort of burden share and share information, share resources and things like that. Those things have kind of depreciated a bit with the advent of capitalism, which obviously gives more incentives for individualism. But by and large, traditionally speaking, Senghor would argue that communalism is really one of the key features that distinguishes the African personality from other groups. And then Senghor identifies a third element, which is sort of our mode of communication with one another and our mode of self-expression, which really emphasizes and places a greater value on rhythm and symbolic image. So in essence, Senghor is saying that we place greater value on sort of like the intangible aesthetic elements of life, as opposed to just the material elements, which tends to be what European cultures kind of values a lot more. So those are some of the things that Senghor would argue kind of unifies Africans and people of African descent. And of course, these are ideal types. They're not necessarily made to sort of, characterize every or to fit every single one, everyone of African descent. So you may have, I know a couple uncles that, for instance, are not very rhythmically inclined, and so some people can fit into some boxes, some people won't. But it really does help you kind of think about, okay, how have scholars throughout the ages try to sort of conceptualize these differences and similarities between Blacks. And I will conclude this particular segment by saying that I think while this framework is useful for understanding, the unifying characteristics, I also do think that it does tend to sort of confine, it does restrict agency, in the sense that it really confines the African, I'm going to just use the word African to kind of to color the entire diaspora as well. So, I do think that it limits agency, in the sense that it confines the African personality to a set of discrete characteristics. And in that way, it fails to sort of capture the diversity in personalities and attitudes that really animate not just Africans, but also people in general. Because I think what we find, and many studies have actually come out to show this, is that while people of a particular race have a lot of similarities, generally speaking, there are actually a lot of internal differences relative to within groups, relative to other groups. And so that is to say, Africans may have differences, a lot more differences within each other than they would, say, to like an Asian American or something like, or an Asian or something like that. So the final question I want to tackle in my short period here is, what role does racism and colonialism play in shaping the relationship between Africans and African Americans? And of course, as my former panelists have indicated, this history of shared trauma really shapes and colors our entire interaction, right? How we as Black people view the world, and how we view each other and our role in the world, and how we interact with other people, with folks of other races as well. And it's because of this shared experience of colonialism and slavery and racism and all these different traumatic systems of oppression that really makes it possible, for instance, for an Oromo of Ethiopia to view a Yoruba of Nigeria and a Black
1 minute
Brazilian
left.
as
1 minute left.
Oh crap, that was extremely bad, as a brethren. And so, and it really underlies like the internal struggle that all colonized people grapple with. And, scholars such as Sheikh Anta Diop, W.E.B. Du Bois in his idea of the double consciousness and the racialized self, and Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask, they all really try to grapple with this sort of internal dichotomy that Africans and people of African descent really grapple with, which, as Bernard and others talked about, is this idea that in our attempt to sort of liberate ourselves, we do so in comparison to our former colonizers. And so, in a sense, the Black identity is pretty much is inextricably connected to white identity as well. And so, I would just conclude that even though I disagree with Fanon in terms of how he conceptualizes the role of history in our modern or in a contemporary life, in our everyday life, I do agree with him that the ultimate goal that we should be striving towards is to liberate ourselves from the imperative or the inclination to compare our values and our successes, our self-worth to the other, and that Black liberation is in many ways is a very internal process. And until we really get to a point where we can assert our value on our own terms without having to say, oh, well, we should be accepted because we're better or because we're worse or whatever, compared to another group, that we should know we should get to a point. And I know we have some work to do in this area, but the goal is to really get to a point where our self-worth and our values is validated by the fact of our humanity, as opposed to, anything else. So with that, thank you all so much for your time. I really thought that I would have a lot more time to talk, but all right.
Well, thank you, Brother Yakasa, for your nice conclusion there. I think it kind of speaks to the goal of this whole panel, which is how do we get to a point where our humanity is recognized, not in comparison to anybody else's humanity, but just our humanity. So I wanted to thank you for making that point.
Well, that's all the panelists, and we want to open up the time for questions and comments. I have not seen any, so we have about 18 minutes left. So as you send us your questions and comments, the panelists could make some comments too. I'll do very quickly some comments here.
But I do see a question. There's a question that says, how do you teach young people to work collaboratively and overcome these stereotypes, beliefs, when the family dynamics community might reinforce them?
Okay, I'll just go ahead and finish up with that. Just make these quick points here and chime in on that. One is, if you are African, you migrated here, and if you choose not to engage the plight of African Americans for self-interest or whatever, the thing is, you will be still seen as Black in this country. So if you speak differently or word clothes differently, you still are judged as Black, and out of self-interest, you should take up the struggle. Not look at the plight or the socioeconomic disparities of African Americans as a self-contained system or in a vacuum, that there's a historical basis for why there is crime and incarceration and unemployment. Racism, institutional racism. Real quickly here, African Americans, to that question that you were just pointing to, as far as African Americans are concerned, we need to educate ourselves about Africa itself and not buy into the sort of Western American colonized view of what Africa looks like. I had a nurse who's a student of mine who said someone in a hospital asked her, she was from Kenya, and the person said, how do the clothes fit? Because don't wear clothes in Africa, you're in the jungle. So the same kind of stuff. So we need to educate ourselves by watching, for example, movies that are produced by Africans, and there are plenty of those. To Etienne, to the man who said, you're not Black, probably what he was struggling with is, have you experienced racism in this country? If you have, and that was what he was questioning, I think, if you have, there should be no basis at all. And I think that might be where he was coming from. Have you shared that struggle with African Americans? That's all I was gonna, let me see, share there. So if there are any questions or panelists like to chime in, feel free to do so.
I'd like to answer that question as well about teaching the youth how to collaborate. So can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So this is Keya speaking. I don't know why my picture isn't, oh, there we go, hi. So I'd like to answer that question as well. I am really big on identity and self-awareness and emotional vulnerability in order to reach a self-actualization of just an individual, so that way we can be our best selves, right? We have all of this potential within us, but until we have people pour into us, like our African brothers and sisters, our African Americans, our elders are so useful. There's so much knowledge that the elders have of experiences that they've been through, that their grandparents have been through, but sometimes we don't always want to listen because this American society as a whole is me, mine, mine. I know better than you. I'm going to do it differently because time is different, even though the same circumstances are cycling throughout the decades, correct? So one of the things that I would like to say to my African American brothers and sisters is that we have to be emotionally vulnerable. We have to say that we're hurting when we're hurting. We have to seek therapy, whether it be from another sister or brother who's African American, a counselor. We cannot keep this old adage of what happens in this house stays in this house. No, for too many years, our voices were silenced, and now is the time to really come to terms with your past, your childhood, talk to your parents about their past and their childhood so you can figure out why they may treat you the way that they do. I remember there was this adage like, oh, I had to be home before the streetlights came on. Do you even know where that came from? There were sundown towns, and if there were African Americans caught out in certain parts of the world or certain parts of the country after the sun came down, they were going to be lynched and hung. Some of our parents were beating us because they were beaten, because their ancestors were beaten for being, for not listening. Or there was one more thing that I wanted to, broken homes. I could understand, I don't have children yet, but thinking about how there are some parents who are like, oh no, my boy is dumb. You don't want nothing. He don't know nothing. Back in the day in slavery times, or human trafficking rather, because that's what it was. If you were to talk about your child as an African-American woman or a slave or man, about your child being the smartest, the this, that, and the third, the strongest, the master would take your child from you and sell them up the river, sell them down the river, and you would never see them again. So a lot of these psychological things of us downplaying each other, maybe men and women are not connecting with each other because there's still that old trauma of, if I connect you and I love you so much, something might take you away from me. And I just want us to move past all of that, but we really have to be honest about any sort of molestation that's been going on in our household or our family or our history, so we can become whole individuals and be healthy individuals to teach our children healthy principles, so that way they can grow in confidence and come into communication and collaboration with each other for the betterment of our community from within our community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keya, for that. I would like to comment on a question that I see here from Steve about, if Africans resent being stereotyped, then why would they embrace the stereotypes of African Americans? I think that's a great question. And I think it's a question that could probably, warrant a whole conversation in of itself. But I think the reason for that is because, stereotypes are, they're just kind of shortcut ways for people to try to conceptualize and understand people, right? And the issue with shortcuts is that they don't get the whole picture. They don't capture the complexity of a group of people or of any situation. And so they're simplifications in essence. And it's really the same reason why any group of people accept them, because it makes our job a lot easier in terms of processing when we encounter other people. Like if you have a stereotype in your mind about a particular person and you see them, you don't have to work too hard to try to understand that person. You can kind of, your understanding of that person is already sort of constructed for you, so you don't have to do a lot of thinking about it. And so that's in my opinion, that's sort of the function of stereotypes, which of course is not good. And so what we have to do is really challenge ourselves. And this kind of even goes back to the first question that Keya was just kind of speaking to. We really have to kind of challenge ourselves to educate ourselves about the different groups of people, about where our internal biases may be coming from, and getting to know community members and having conversations with them, developing real relationships with them. I know I was very fortunate to come from Africa at a very young age, where I grew up with African Americans. So a lot of the challenges that some of the colleagues on the panel had with respect to not having that sort of relationship with the African American peers, I didn't have that issue growing up, because I very much grew up in the African American dominated environment, where I actually identify as an African American. I also identify as Liberian. I identify as Black. I identify as all of that. I don't really make a huge deal out of those categories. But yeah, I think that's basically what it is. It's a way for people to accept. It's a shortcut. Stereotypes really serve as a shortcut, and we do need to sort of push against that a bit in terms of being more proactive about challenging stereotypes.
I agree with everything you said. Yeah, for sure. It is a shortcut, and I would also just get at it from a different perspective, and that is Chimamanda Adichie on YouTube. You'll find talks about a single story, the danger of a single story. Sometimes we have a single story view of each other, and therefore we make a judgment only on that very limited perspective that we have of someone. We also all have blind spots, and sometimes I can't see my own blind spot. I need somebody else to see my blind spot and make me aware of it, and that's often the case with stereotypes. They hold an inkling of the truth, and we stretch it to label a different people group or even just another person. And therefore, we need a greater awareness, as you've said, that self-awareness as well as that group awareness. Stereotypes are very dangerous because they're also used to control and they're used to devalue. And as Brother Samuel said, we have to see each other's humanity. And that means looking beyond the stereotype.
So with regard to the matter of stereotype, and certainly in terms of the history of labels, I can remember talking to my dad when I was a teenager, and he told me that when he was a teenager, if one African-American man called another African-American man black, that was an invitation for a fight to the death. Whereas by the 1970s, thanks to poets like Langston Hughes, Nikki Giovanni, the great African-American playwrights, and we must thank James Brown, who sang, "Say it loud, I'm black.
And I'm proud.
And I'm proud." Not I'm colored and I'm proud. Not I'm a nigger and I'm proud. We would have to wait till the hip hop movement for that term to be recaptured and attempted to be redefined, if you will. But still, the amazing thing about history is that we are studying a cyclical process of human behavior. And just like I hope you all voted early, we're seeing our slice of this cycle of history. In The Lion King, they talked about the circle of life. Well, we get to view the circle of history because all you have to do is go back and look at some of not even the 2000 presidential election, but the 1876 presidential election, which was even more crucial to the forward progress and the backward retrogression of African-American privileges as citizens. I certainly cannot recommend Ava DuVernay's documentary film 13th highly enough. She does just a knockdown, drag-out job of discussing all of the different layers of the 13th Amendment, what it meant, but also what it did not mean. Okay, I'll stop there.
I'll throw in a quick comment about the issue of stereotypes and at least within us as Africans and African Americans is to stop this notion that we are monolithic. And even though we say it, we still don't behave that way. So we say some of us are not talking black enough and some of us are talking white, and he thinks or she thinks he's educated and all that. So these things that have value intrinsically, so we shun them when they are exemplified by any one of us. When it's a white person who has those same features, it's okay. I like to say real quickly here, and let somebody chime in, that there's a concept in philosophy called family resemblance, and it's out of the philosopher Wittgenstein, who said if you look at a family, like if you have a set of 5 members, not one of them looks exactly like any other member. That these two may have the same nose, but not the same eyes. But then if another pair may have the same ears or whatever, but they're all from the same family. If you look at the Walker family, for example, you'll know a Walker, but we don't have the same features, but we have a family resemblance. And so when you think about the African-American community and culture, it is very detrimental to say what Black is and what it is not. There is a family resemblance, that there are many things that allow us to express ourselves, but there's no necessary and sufficient conditions that define any particular person as African-American.
Okay, I would like to, can you hear me?
Yes, Sam.
Okay, I would like to just make two observations because
we got 3 minutes as far as I know.
Okay, I will make a quick point. I think based on the discussion we have had, I feel very compelled to observe that there's a way I feel the failure of liberal democracy in terms of the promise it made to humanity, because it seems like liberal democracy, as we're talking about all these things we're trying to do, it sees you as an individual in terms of your self-interest. Okay, that's the way liberal democracy sees citizens. The typical citizen of a liberal democracy is known as res idiotica, which means he's an idiot. Idiot doesn't mean you're not intelligent or whatever, but you're just narrowly absorbed about something that is going to be good for you. So we have to understand that every day we look at our TV, we listen to our politicians. Often they are not appealing to the common good, but they are appealing to something, your self-interest. And this can be a problem. The second point that I think I want to make, and that's the final point, is just that there's a way in which, based on all that has been presented, I feel there's a failure in the United States of Judeo-Christian civilization again. Because if you look at some of the beliefs of Judeo-Christian civilization, we shouldn't be dealing with these issues. And Christianity has been in existence for over 2,000 years now, but we're still dealing with this issue, okay? So there's a way in which we are dealing with much broader failures in our civilization, not just what is happening among us, because a lot of the differences among us are differences, as we have noticed, that have been created by the way the system is always pushing us to compete against each other so that we can succeed, and success means there are going to be losers and there are going to be winners. Thank you very much.
And I wanted to build on that by saying it is up to us to go over that division, that way of the system has tried to kind of pin each other against one another. And this is what this discussion is about. What can we do so that when we are with a brother or a sister, we don't see them necessarily as a competitor, but perhaps somebody that could lift us up, somebody who could watch our back. I think it's going to have to get to the point where we have discussions like this to know each other better and see the similarities that we have with each other, try to live with what we don't share as views, but try to go for the greater good, because divided, we will fall. And we have fallen for hundreds and hundreds of years. I think now is the time to go beyond our divisions.
And I want to chime in on, as a parent, what can we do? As parents, we need to educate ourselves about the African-American culture. As a single mother who has 2 boys, I would love to have a mentorship. So this is a program I registered before COVID for the boys and girls, and I requested an African-American man, okay? And I've been waiting for 2 years. After COVID hit, I never even pursued it. So we need African-American men to volunteer to those boys and girls so that I can take so they have someone that they can rely on, someone they can learn from. See a strong African-American brother who can teach them ropes. So those are my recommendation. I want my African-American brothers and African brothers to step up and volunteer and mentor these young children. Thank you.
we would love to have some comments from those out there in Cyberland to post questions or make some comments.
Bernard, there was a question about how do we keep this conversation going? How do we implement these initiatives in our communities and society?
Well, I would like to take that question. I've known Bernard for a few years now, and Hoya and I have been friends for about 10 years now. We keep talking, and we are going to have to try to create the community we want. If you live in a city, try to find people who live in there and try to create or forge a relationship with them. Try to be yourself and try to know who they are so that we don't live on our isolated islands, living in our, with our misconceptions, with our, on our islands, and then not trying to join the fight for equal right that people fought for really hard for us to be here today as human beings and be accepted as such. So it's going to have to go to community creation, community building among each other. Thank you.
I would add to that, Etienne, that we need to learn the history of this country. We need to learn the history of African-American struggle.
Amen.
For the rights that we take for granted, the people who died so that we could have these freedoms. We need to learn all of that. I am indebted to many African-Americans who have suffered so that I could come to a country where at least, even if there's racism, I can also still count on a certain amount of civil rights in this country. Samuel and Bernard and myself have been friends for many years. If it wasn't for Melvin, who had introduced me in a very loving way to the African-American community, I wonder what my attitude would have been. Bernard, Samuel, and I visit each other's homes. We've had meals together, and that also reinforces your point, Etienne. So we need to cross those bridges and not create gulfs between us.
Well, thank everybody for being on the panel here. I didn't mention myself, but at the beginning, but I am Bernard Walker. For those who don't know, professor of philosophy at Century College. I would like to make my material available, the written material, and if any of my panelists would like to do so as well, any recommendation of books, I'd like to make that available as well. I know, Sam, you probably have tons of stuff that you could recommend. But any other panelists, and the panelists, if you have some stuff written out, if you want, you could send it to me, and then we could probably make, upon request, the material that we talked about available in written form. I'll just speak for myself because I did run out of time. But I think we're out of time here.
One more thing I would like to add here.
Yes, Etienne.
It's a pitch to the audience. Thank you for being here tonight. And if you have ideas for how we can continue to do this, it shouldn't be a one and done kind of discussion or conversation. So if you have ideas for how we move forward, this is a grassroots thing that just started. Ideas are welcome. Thank you.
And Etienne, is it real quickly, you and I talked about a part 2 of this, right? Because we could talk about this forever.
Right.
And so I'm open to a part 2 of this topic to TBA, but I think it would be good perhaps to talk about the commonality between African Americans and Africans in terms of culture. And several of you talked about that. You mentioned that, Yakuza, you mentioned a number of things there. Leon, you mentioned some things as well. And I think it would be important to just find out what are some things that are positive things within various cultures, African-American culture, Kenyan, Nigerian, whatever, and see the commonalities that exist between us, because there is a common thread. for sure. So with that, I think we probably could wrap up this evening. And I'd like to thank the panelists for being on here. Very informative, very educational what you guys shared. And I would definitely be open to a part 2 of this. And for the audience, stay tuned. We just might do that, TBA, when that would happen. Thank you.